Good. Okay. Well, welcome. This is the Pushing Boundaries podcast, and I am your host, Dr. Thomas Verny. Let me say right at the beginning that this is not a podcast with bells and whistles and an annoying musical score and bombastic claims to be the best, the funniest, or the most outrageous podcast in the whole universe. Just conversations with highly creative people, established or emerging scientists, writers, and scholars working at the cutting edge of their disciplines and whose accomplishments I truly value. I'm interested in unconventional research, breakthrough discoveries, unconventional ideas. I talk with my guests about the things they care about, how they got there, where they are now, and perhaps where they are headed. And today it gives me great pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Howard Eisenberg. Just a few words about how Dr. Eisenberg, he has just recently published a fantastic book called Dream It to Do It, The Science and the Magic. And then there is a second kind of a heading, which is also called Decoding Reality to Zero. A few words about Dr. Eisenberg before I let him speak to you directly. Dr. Eisenberg has a Bachelor of Science, Honors Psychology, and a Master's of Psychology, and an MD from McGill University, which is one of our best universities, and was the recipient of various scholarships. He has also been a faculty member at several universities, most recently as an associate professor of medicine at the University of Vermont. At the University of Vermont, he was additionally co-founder of an interdisciplinary study group on complementary and alternative medicine. One more addition here. His professional memberships have included the American Society for Training and Development, Organization Development Network, Product Development and Management Association, the Strategic Leadership Forum, oh my goodness, I'm getting tired, and the Neuro Leadership Institute. Welcome, Dr. Eisenberg.
Thank you, Tom. So good to talk with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. So just in terms of yourself, before we talk about your book, which obviously we want to do, you are living in Canada now?
Yes, I'm living in a small rural town.
And how long have you lived in this small rural town?
Losing sense of time these days. There's so much time involved in life right now. It's hard to believe that my first book was almost half a century ago. I think I'm going on about 14 years. Here in this location. Before that, I was in Toronto.
Okay. And so when you're living in this small town, like, do you still see patients?
These days, all virtually. So I did have an office in Newmarket until the pandemic, and I realized what was coming. And so I terminated my lease. And since then, I've been working virtually by Zoom video or phone. And it's actually worked out fairly well. It's an adjustment, but it's worked out fairly well.
Yeah, good. Okay, well, let's have a look at this book with a somewhat strange title. What is meant by dream it to do it? What is it?
It is whatever the, how should I say, desired outcome might be.
Oh, I see. So could you give me an example?
Well, as I know a little bit about your biography, when you were younger,
yes,
and you discovered Sigmund Freud,
yes,
even despite the linguistic challenges to understand, it ignited a dream in you that you wanted to become a psychiatrist. And you found a way to do what you needed to do to get that education and that credentialing at a very high level. Similarly, when you've written your books, and most recently your own very impressive book on the embodied mind, I must say, I'm fascinated by some of the similarities and parallels, even though we've had no contact for 4 decades. So again, I know just in you from these brief examples, you're an example of what I'm talking about, where we envision what we want And then we hopefully think through strategically, step by step, action steps, we speak in corporate terms, to help us get there and make corrections along the way, because we don't know what we're going to encounter, obstacles and resources. And we may also change our goal. But that's how I see it. And as I point out in my book, and not in a theoretical way, because even though it's a small book, it's phenomenally concise. I think it's the most information-dense book there is out there. But for example, I point out that all of our major scientific discoveries and technological developments, all of them without exception, came out of the imagination. So you might call it a daydream, or in some cases, nocturnal, night dream, without exception. And I give them as detailed examples, because that is the way. You first envision it at some level. So, to give you the map, if you like. Sorry, go ahead.
So you're using the word dream, vision, for fantasizing about it, for thinking about it, having a thought.
Yeah, but it's a little more colorful than a thought. That's why I say vision or envisioning or dream. It's a little more, Technicolor 3D. It doesn't seem as sterile or abstract as a thought. Because one of the things they also talk about in, near the end of my book, we get into a more controversial but exciting area of the manifestation, is you really need to have belief. And to have belief, you have to color it in your mind. One of the interesting new technologies in the coaching world is intentional change theory, where instead of, as in conventional psychotherapy, we often ask people what their problems are and what difficulties they've had since we last spoke to them. And we're focusing immediately on the negative, triggering amygdala, et cetera, and decommissioning, taking offline the prefrontal cortex, where they have more resourceful abilities to think. So he starts the other way. He talks about, what do you envision that you desire that you don't have right now, that you prefer to have? That stimulates the prefrontal cortex, or if you like, more, creative thinking, expansive consciousness, and it's more resourceful.
Right. Of course, if you tend to be a depressive or pessimistic person, you will see all the obstacles to your so-called dreams and immediately give up and say, oh, it's too difficult.
Or worse. I mean, there are some people who have very dark dreams and manifest those too on the world, as we even are experiencing to some degree now. So it can go a few different ways. Yes.
Yes. Right. Okay. So you wrote a book many years ago, which was essentially on parapsychology.
That's correct.
So how did you move from that to this?
Okay, I'm glad to answer the question, but just warn you in advance, I can go deep and broad, and you feel free to rein me in terms of other things you may want to ask me about. So when I was around 11 or 12, I started just becoming more curious about life, to understand the world, the broader world, beyond my small community. I lived in a suburb of Montreal, beyond my own religious ethnic background. Just a greater sense there's more out there, and I want to know about it. This is obviously pre-computer days. I'm just shy of 76 right now myself. But I did discover bookstores. And my big hedonistic hit in life was going to the bookstore and buying these paperbacks. And I started learning about just fascinating things. In one area that attracted me very early on was science fiction, which got in me stimulating my imagination, but also noticing that some of the things these people who were fictional, just writers, were envisioning, let's say technologically, subsequently were happening in the world. Yeah. So like when the Russians launched, for example, their first Sputnik, I had been reading space science fiction about such things, but it was only fiction, and they weren't by scientists. And here it was becoming real. So that notion, again, back to your original question too, about dreaming and envisioning, in a sense, a seed was planted back then to some degree about that relationship between envisioning and what actually happens or can happen. I very much was interested in the scientific method from an early age, without even knowing what it was. But my point in saying that was that I didn't want to take anything on the basis of faith. It was just in me, in a rebel. And on the other hand, I didn't want to be in denial. So I was curious to explore things, but not necessarily accept what the authorities might say in some of these different areas that I might be, checking into. As I progressed in my scientific reading, I became aware of what was happening in quantum mechanics, and I found it fascinating. Particularly, I found fascinating the convergence between what they were finding, what they were articulating, and the ancient mystics, which I was also fascinated by, because I was trying to have pretty broad bandwidth, not just what's going on currently, but historically, as well as what might next.
When you say ancient mystics, could you be a little bit more specific?
You mean how I reference them?
Yeah. Who are these ancient mystics that you're referring to? Is it Moses, Abraham? Is it Socrates, Plato?
It is many of those. For example, I do cite, as you may remember, near the beginning of the book, Plato and his allegory of the cave, which I think is a very powerful image of how we can be entrapped in our false beliefs, our delusions, so to speak. So, yeah, I would actually put him partly in that category. But I'm thinking of, you might call the Hindu sages, some of the saints. I also go with the indigenous teachings as well as a source of wisdom. Again, trying to have a very broad bandwidth on all of that. So as I was evolving this awareness and getting more curious, I started becoming curious about whether what I had read years ago in science fiction about things like teleportation and time travel, might it be anyone who seriously looks at such things? So back to my paperback bookstore, and I started to find some things by J.B. Rhine, who was a parapsychologist, one of the most earliest eminent ones in North America and perhaps internationally. He kind of coined the term ESP and developed this famous little card pack, the Zener cards, which had 5 geometrical symbols that he would test people's ESP on. And I actually went down and met him early in my career as well. And sought out a number of chances to go beyond books to actually start meeting some of these famous scientists, and became really curious about the powers potentially of our mind and the other dimensions of reality we were yet to discover, still in a scientific and physical framework. When I say physical framework, it's what I refer to in my book as the materialistic reductionist paradigm of reality. The assumption for many of us is an unchallenged belief that ultimately everything is physical, and complexity just evolves out of that physical basis. And that's a belief.
Most of us write about that. That's interesting. Yeah. About materialism. Yeah. Go on. Yeah.
So I became curious whether I could actually do some research on my own in this area as well. Still, again, thinking in a scientific way. So even my late teens, I started doing experiments where I would intentionally gaze at somebody from the back of a bus or a streetcar who was at the very front to see if they could sense that I was gazing at them. And my intention was they should sense it and turn around quickly and look directly at me. No one else in the bus or streetcar but me. And it worked many, many times, very quickly. Then I decided to up the ante scientifically, sort of. I'm just a kid, right? I'm a teenager at this point. So then I only would choose someone like that at the front if they were engaged in something distracting, like reading something. And that was no challenge either. That wasn't the problem. I still could get them to turn around, notice me very quickly. And also, as I say, look directly at me, not just, seem to be agitated. And then thirdly, I tried one more level. They had to be in conversation with someone right beside them. So they could really, distracted by someone external right beside them. Still wasn't an issue. And then I had it in my appetite now. I'm going to take on this challenge to do serious high-level research in this field. And I'm going to break kind of the logjam of skepticism, disbelief. And I already had been accepted in the medical program at McGill University, where I had been an undergraduate. That's where I did my honors psychology you referred to. And I proposed to them into my first year that they allow me to do a secondary degree at the same time. The secondary degree would be a master's degree, and the thesis topic would be on telepathy. Now, I chose that department in part not just because I was already there in medical school, because at that time, the chairman of the psychology department at McGill University was the very famous psychologist D.O. Hebb, who at one point was the president of the American Psychological Association, head of our department at McGill of psychology, and became the chancellor at one point at the university too. So esteemed gentleman and scientist. And yet he had said half a century or so before, and he's put this in print, that he rejected all the evidence for parapsychological research, psychic phenomena, because a priori it was impossible. He wasn't questioning the dishonesty or sloppiness of the experimenters or the misinterpreted statistics. He denied the possibility. And I took that on as a challenge. I like challenges. I said, I don't just go with the status quo, never did. And so I took it on that I will do this subject in his department and convince him that he was wrong, which eventually turned out to be correct. And I cite again his taking back what he'd said before about this being impossible and admitting at least telepathy was possible because my research was on telepathy. So that's what kind of was leading me into, very quickly, summary, how I got to parapsychology. Now, back to your question too about the book and how did I come to the book? 3 years before I wrote the book, so this is out back in 2018, I was invited to do a keynote presentation for the annual conference of a group of healers of therapeutic touch, what the Bible refers to as the laying on of hands. And these people approach it in a more scientific and clinical way. And to honor the invitation to be the keynote presenter, I decided I would do a really deep dive back into the parapsychological literature, which I had not really been very involved in as I continue my medical career, my other academic career, and some entrepreneurial things over the years, but to go really, really deep into it again to see what indeed have changed, what have they discovered, what are the prevailing theories, who's who, and so on. What other sources can I, find? And then similarly with quantum mechanics, going really back down into deep understanding of what the leading edge physicists were saying about their understanding of reality, as well as going deeper again and back into, as I said to you, the literature of the mystics, translations, obviously in my case. But I also had the chance to, over the years, to meet sometimes with shaman and gurus, which was also, part of my awareness in the background. And when I started to go into that deep dive, I guess about 3 years before the actual taking on the book in 2018, suddenly things congealed, and I don't know if you want to call it crystallized or insight or almost like a revelation. I did not hear voices, I did not see anything, but suddenly I had a fundamental realization. I realized that the assumption that we all have, almost as they say, is an unquestioned belief, that of course the material world is out there, it is solid, it is predictable. Of course other people are there and they are separate from us and they can't affect us by magical forces and all of those things. I suddenly realized that the truth of our fuller understanding of reality from all sources combined, and they're convergent. It's not just trying to take bits and pieces, it's convergent. This is the mystics were convergent with the understanding now in quantum mechanics, that the reality is consciousness. It's the only thing, in part going back to Descartes, but as you know, I cite other examples in my book, it's the only thing we can be absolutely certain about, that we're aware of being aware, period. We cannot even be aware, as I pointed in my book, that we're not in a dream level of awareness or a drug state of awareness. All we know is we're aware of being aware. All the rest is conjecture to some degree. Because if you can't be sure if, for example, you're dreaming or not, no matter what you think your educational background is and your understanding of science, technology, whatever it might be, if it's only a dream, then it doesn't have, we would say, reality. And yet, but if you can't tell the difference if it's a dream or not, then how solid is, again, the sense of reality? And plus, as you know, in physics, because you cite some of this in your own excellent book, our whole notion of what solidity is in terms of material reality is totally fallacious. There's no scientist who would say it's true, correct, quite the opposite. There aren't even fundamental atomic particles, going back to Democritus. All we have are zones of probability. And those probability waves only collapse into something sort of solid, so to speak, when we observe them. It takes human consciousness to observe it. So all the evidence, pointing that direction. And then my background in medicine and yours, we've been taught, again, unquestionably taught, the brain is a source and the source of our mind, of our consciousness. I remember being taught somewhere informally along the line, because I had 3 degrees and I read a lot, that it was a primitive thinking before modern science, that the brain was in the heart, not in the head. And that's primitive. That's like stupid, just like Lamarckism is stupid. And epigenetics can't happen. As I say, I like to, as you do, to question things. And I have this insatiable need, to learn and understand for myself. So I discovered, as you cite too, one, if you want to talk about the brain coming out of something physical, which itself is a huge leap of faith, then let's be honest. We know there's more than one source of so-called brain in our body beyond the one in the head. The heart one with its own nervous system, its own memory system, its own ability to control the brain. Our microbiome, those dumb bacteria that through the vagus nerve can downregulate the nervous system almost instantaneously, et cetera, and affect our moods and so on. And that's just the beginning. As you say, you can go down to a cellular level as well. But then beyond that, and this is big, there is no proof in any area of science, and that includes whatever you want, psychology, neurology, physiology, if there's some other areas where this is relevant in terms of the brain function and its importance and understanding how it works. There's none scientific evidence that the brain, I'm going back to the conventional thing of the head brain, produces consciousness. There's not even a theory that can explain how a material brain can give rise to immaterial consciousness. And back to my point, so the evidence strongly is towards what we call the primacy of consciousness. And that's, scary territory for some people. For one, with our psychiatric training, we're taught like, you're getting to magical thinking, delusional thinking here. I was just reading an article earlier today on derealization. I think it just came out in Scientific American and saying, maybe derealization is actually not totally off. Maybe they're actually aware of the illusory nature of reality sometimes, and it's not always pathological. Anyway, I could go obviously on and on. You may want to rein me in.
Okay, well, it's fascinating, truly, most fascinating. So my question is then, I have grappled, as I'm sure you have too, with the meaning of consciousness. Like, what is really meant by consciousness? So perhaps you could give us like your interpretation.
I'll give it on 2 levels, a lighter and a deeper level. So on the lighter levels, I partly referenced before, I think of consciousness as awareness of being aware. So it's not just awareness, it's awareness of being aware in the most fundamental way. Secondly, and you haven't asked this, but it's a deeper answer to your perhaps question and curiosity on this. So why is consciousness important? What does it have to do with us? What does it have to do with our world? As I said, the evidence strongly in every area, and I would welcome anyone who will point out if I'm wrong, because it's not an ego thing for me. I want, like you do, to know. So if I'm missing something, I'd like to know that.
Right.
But back to the point I'm trying to make here is that the only thing we can know, as I say, is our consciousness. That doesn't mean that our life, our existence, our apparent separation, independence, it doesn't mean that has no meaning. Even if it's illusion, the illusion is not that it's not part of our experience, because it is part of our experience. The illusion is to buy into that's all there is, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I think consciousness, and I have to use anthropomorphic terms here, which I partly apologize for, but we're humans on this level, talking English, plain language, and to put it in a way that isn't too confusing to people. So I can use the analogy of ourselves. When we get bored, we often daydream. And some of us have very vivid daydreams. Mm-hmm. When we sleep, some of us, even as adults, still can have sometimes a really bad dream, a nightmare, even night terrors. And in those states, we're experiencing a different state of consciousness on one level. but also a different sense of reality completely. And we do it in the case of daydreaming because we're bored, usually. And sometimes night dream too, unfulfilled fantasies and so on. You know, it's a whole big umbrella, perhaps, for a lot of different reasons to explain why we have our dreams. But the point I'm making is this. So if consciousness is awareness of being aware, there's something else required here. If the primary reality is consciousness itself, for consciousness itself to have that awareness of being aware, there has to be something to be aware of. So it needs what I'll call us and the phenomenal world for its own, in a sense, awareness. And going back to another quote I give, because I tried a lot of things together. And again, we use the same expression, connecting dots, which was fascinating. Talk about, you know, some of the synchronicity here. That like Shakespeare's, you know, all the words are stage and we're but players on it. So like some would say, we're the eyes and ears of the underlying consciousness, or if people think in more religious terms, God consciousness. So again, it's not that it's an illusion in the sense that this has no reality. I'm not questioning that. I'm saying it's not at all the fuller extent of reality. It's a very limited bandwidth experience or sampling of potentially something much fuller, more resourceful, and much more important for our survival and well-being for ourselves and our planet.
Well, that brings me right to the next question. So what practical use can a reader make, having read that, having listened to this podcast, having listened to us talking? How will this potentially change their life?
So it's a really good question. And you asked me, you know, earlier too, I think, about my psychotherapy practice and certification, but I'm still doing psychotherapy. As we both know, these are horrifically dark times in so many ways. I mean, bad enough we just had the European war, or bad enough we just had this pandemic and people aren't managing properly. There's so much more. And I don't want to go down a laundry list and depress people, but it's a lot. And so when I've had patients before with anxiety disorders and depression disorders, usually they were dealing with internal demons, unless, you know, they're in an abusive, traumatic situation at the time. Now the demons are all too real around us, so to speak. It's not just our imagination of what, you know, if this happens, what if that happens. These things are happening, so to speak. So back to your question. So the teachings in my book, as I connected the dots and understood things differently, really allow me in a confident way to give my patients hope and a sense of empowerment at a time when they feel so disempowered and they feel that life's just happening to them. And I'm saying by contrast, no, life doesn't just have to happen to you. As you know, I also quote, you know, Viktor Frankl, who lived on hell and earth. And I love, you know, this particular quote, which I teach them: between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our freedom to choose. And I'm teaching them about what I call the expansiveness or the spaciousness of consciousness. There's so much more resourcefulness potentially within us. In practical terms, I teach them, you don't have to be who you were. In practical terms, I teach them the only reality is right now, not yesterday, not maybe what will happen tomorrow. Now, claim this territory. That alone will tremendously relieve, you know, anxiety and depression.
May I stop you for a second?
So there's for me, a lot of practical applications of this.
Yeah, just stop you for a second and remind our listeners that I'm speaking to Dr. Howard Eisenberg, and we are talking about his fantastic, wonderful new book, Dream It to Do It, The Science and the Magic. It's a great book, and it's available on Amazon and everywhere else, I imagine.
Primarily online, Amazon, Chapters, Indigo, Barnes and Noble, and internationally.
Right. The usual suspects.
Well, not bookstores these days.
Okay. So coming back to you, Howard. So may I ask, how has it changed your life?
Well, that's another good question. Thank you. So when I had this realization back in 2018, as I was doing that deep data dump, that our assumption again of materialism being the obvious objective reality and everything comes from that was wrong, and it was the other way around. Consciousness is the primary reality. I also was becoming more aware and concerned about what's happening in our world. I've always been sensitive as a person, which partly led me to become a therapist. But I also, back to your earlier question about parapsychology and so on, I did have experiences when I was younger, samples, sometimes if you call it non-ordinary reality, never in a way that was ego dystonic or stressful, but just awareness that some things, like the thing that I told you on the transit vehicles where I did the experiment, but sometimes spontaneously as well. So I had a personal sense too of some of this, but I also, part of that was a sense of the future. And some of us call it precognition, premonition, different words for it. And it's been with me for a long time, since early life, and not always, how should I say, in a welcomed way. And particularly these last several years, because the things I have envisioned that are coming, manifesting, happening, are not good things. These are, again, are very dark times in so many different areas. They're existential threats, as we know. And this is building up in me, this awareness, and also this, maybe in Buddhist terms, compassion for others, loving kindness for others. It wasn't a choice. And then I felt it, as I said in my book, I felt called. I felt I have to do this. And even though I was personally feeling the stress of all the things that were going on, compounded by needier patients at this time that I was continuing to work with, and also thinking partly in a partly negative way, it's too late. I mean, things are too far gone. People are also being too distracted, and I had to persevere through that. Had some also major health challenges. Had to persevere, through that too. And I felt it's not a choice. I have to do this. And I contacted some of the reputable publishers, and I said, I feel called. I have to write this book as a wake-up call for the world. And I had very good credentials, obviously, that I could show them quite quickly. But I said, how quickly can you get it out into the market? And they said, after your manuscript would be approved, at least 1 to 2 years, to be honest. And I know, as you know, perhaps, if you send a manuscript to be approved, first of all, they don't do it day of. It may go to a committee. It may take a few weeks. They may send it back, ask for revisions. And then you're starting the clock from another year or two after that. And I thought, the world can't wait. So I decided I have to self-publish this. I knew nothing about publishing. And I didn't exactly have funds. I used retirement funds. But I felt I just have to do this. So again, it's been a calling ever since I had that awareness. With that came the sense of deep compassion and obligation. I have to do it. And fortunately, I'm finding some other people, even to light some parts of your book. Again, I repeat, we could do a whole other podcast on that, by the way. There are some other people and organizations in the world, some emerging more so right now because of what's going on, who are enlightened, who are caring, who want to be collaborative. And I'm, welcoming that very much. As I say, I self-published this. It wasn't done for profit, used retirement savings. But I don't feel my name has to be attached to it. I mean, it just helps other people, teachers, clergy, leaders. Then that's, gives me some satisfaction that it's making a difference. Go ahead, sorry.
I thought it was a New Zealand publisher, or is that the self-publisher?
No, it's actually in the US. It's printed in the US.
Printed in the US.
And my company legally, technically, is the publisher, Sintrek, but the actual printing company is in the US.
Okay, okay. And are you getting good exposure with it?
Well, I unlike a book publisher, there's no one out there, putting the word out to stocking bookstores and displays and or ads or anything of that nature. So it's through podcasts, other people who are learning of me and have an interest and spreading the word.
Well, hopefully this will help. So what sort of obstacles did you find as you were beginning to explore this subject? Did you run into some internal or external obstacles?
You mean once I decided that I want to do a book at this time? Well, as I said, there was a partly like, the negative self-talk naysayer saying like, it's too late. Things are too far gone. And also the other side of that, the people are now so distracted, so tuned out that too, that there's not going to be that audience out there. But I thought through it as I try to teach my patients, back to your question, the application of some of these ideas. I teach them to think through their feelings, not to suppress them, not to deny and pretend they're not there. Think through them. It's just something coming up for you. You have choices, spaces of conscience, how you work with it. So I thought through that and I thought, okay, thinking more practically, yeah, people are distracted. So if I write this as a big book, like my first book was 200 pages, and by the way, only 200 pages because my publisher insisted on it because of the paper cost. I thought that was so insane, but I had a contract and I had to go, with them at that time. So, but on this one, so it's not that I'm uncomfortable or unable to do a long book. But I thought, if it's a big book, there's more disincentive for people not even to try. Mm-hmm. It's more like, how am I ever going to get, to a book like that? So I thought, I'll make it smaller. I'll make it more condensed. No padding, just hopefully pearls. Mm-hmm. And as you know, I gave exercises too, so people could have an experiential
very good
sense of some of this, not just take it on belief or because of its logical argument. So I had to go through that one, thinking it through. So how do I, as I say, not just be blocked by the fact people are distracted, it's factual. How do I work with that? And then I thought, too, because they're distracted, and because some people just don't even read anymore, and I don't mean big books, even maybe newspaper or magazines. It's just like the bit economy, just bits of this and bits of that. I thought I will also use multiple platforms. So I also put it out as an ebook, for people who won't read a physical, document. And then just recently, a few weeks ago, I put it as an audiobook.
That's good.
As well, reasoning a lot, especially the younger people are more into the audiobook. Or at first, back to your question again. So when I thought of the audiobook, which was actually suggested to me, by the way, by some younger readers, gave me some feedback, meaning it as a positive suggestion. They said, you may want to know, for our crowd, audiobooks are, more the thing. And my first reaction, I even debated with someone who said that to me, was that, well, actually, that wouldn't be a good idea because it's a very, very deep book. It's very provocative. It's a very, very different way of thinking and experiencing things. And if you're distracted even more so because you're listening to a book while you're doing things or traveling, which is you use audiobooks, like you're probably going to miss most of it. I thought it through and I thought, well, if it still reaches some people wouldn't reach at all, is that still a good thing? Yes, because I'm trying to go for a global wake-up call. The more, the better in terms of this case. And secondly, then I thought in terms of going back to the brain, because I work on both levels. I say, I'm not saying this is not real too, just it's one level. So in my work, sometimes I call brain-based coaching, teaching people how to partly self-regulate, in part, a brain processes and functions. So using that process almost in an iterative way, taking on some real, again, negative self-talk, objections, and some real obstacles like the distracted, population, but thinking it through in terms of how can I though find a way and value. And I thought, so back to the audiobook one, that not only may appeal to some people who just wouldn't ever look at a book, even an ebook, but it's a different part of the brain, getting that stimulation, getting that message. And I also thought, and think now, by the way, now that it's out, the ideal is to experience it both ways, to read the book and also have the audiobook.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
and there are some special things I did with the audiobook, which I will not say what they are, just to enhance it as an experience.
Okay. So my other question is, you have been married now for some time.
Mm-hmm.
What role, if any, did your wife play in your writing this book?
The most indirect one, in the sense that some years ago, which she knew I wrote my first one a long time ago, right, 50 years ago, she suggested, you should really write some other books. And especially as you maybe are heading, towards retirement, to something else, to do you might find stimulating and worthwhile. So that little seed, if you want, from some years ago. But in terms of this particular subject or the reason why I did this, no. Her attitude was, it's your thing, so. very solo. And I didn't even have anyone review my manuscript
Really?
before it went. I was going for speed and I was just taking a chance. I hired some editors, for grammatical things, the style. I just took a chance. Big chance. But I thought the speed was so important. I mean, so many bad things have happened since it came out in mid-November of last year, as you know.
Yes, it's true. It's true. What about your parents? Are they still alive?
No, they're not.
So they are not aware of this success.
Well, maybe on a level they are. No, not that I'm aware of.
Somewhere else. So, but you're still seeing patients.
Yes.
How have your patients reacted to this book?
I thought this book might actually scare some people, and I actually have, a warning at the beginning of the book saying, people who are suffering from mental health issues, perhaps, should not read it unless advised, whether healthcare providers. Coming back to your question with my own patient population, which is very diverse, it's been very positively received. I thought some of them might think, oh, he's crazy. I can't, be depending in some ways on his advice. No, quite the opposite. It's been very, very complimentary. More important, I don't mean that on an ego level. They found value in it. And I love hearing them give me examples of how they're applying some of what they've learned in it.
That's nice. That's very nice. So you mentioned a few scientists, scholars, academics that have helped you along the way. Can you back to that, like, who would you say were the three most important people that you met who positively influenced you in exploring the subject?
I had a high school science teacher, the last name was Oliver, Mr. Oliver, we called him, who just sensed my curiosity and encouraged it broadly. I remember that. Also, I've had a very long relationship, fortunately, as colleague and friend with the person who wrote the foreword for my book, Dr. Stanley Krippner. It's maybe too strong to call him a mentor, but he's been somewhat of a mentor figure for me. He was out there longer than me, obviously, in a much broader way. And I not only valued his knowledge, his wisdom, but I've had from the beginning, and even more so as time has gone on, phenomenal respect for the role modeling he offers by just being there as he is, in terms of not being too much into his own ego. So at all his books, all his honors, all his accomplishments, I never sense he's egotistical about any of it, ever. And that really has impressed me for a long time. So on both levels, both the knowledge and meaningful discussions about areas of science, he also has a broad interest. But also when he was role modeling, just being himself. And I was fortunate to experience that.
How did you manage to meet him? How did that happen?
As with J.B. Ryan, at the time I was living, in Montreal, and I just ventured down once in a while to the U.S. When I heard of some of these scientific meetings going on in parapsychology. And so I met him at one of those, probably in New York City, many, 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 many decades ago. And just kept up a conversation with him somehow. This is again before email too, so it was a little more awkward then, but still, it's been a half century.
Well, I think that's important for our listeners, because people often are so shy, they don't approach someone that they would really like to talk to, would really like to get to be on friendly terms. And you proved the opposite. You were interested in this guy, you liked what he was doing, you approached him, and you developed a lifelong friendship.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a good model to follow.
Thank you. That's fortunate.
Okay, so before I leave you, I thought, I told you at the beginning before we started that I went to the funeral of a very dear, which has sort of put me into kind of a retrospective mood a little bit. So my question is, what is it you would like to be remembered for?
Well, I'm more concerned with the present than what I remembered for. No, no, serious. It goes back to why I wrote this book and why I'm even doing this podcast with you now. What I'm desperately seeking, somehow being a contributor to waking people up soon enough, broadly enough, globally, that we can reverse course and save ourselves. So I'm more concerned with what I yet have to do and my goal, my intention, and less about what I may be remembered for. I'm not sure there will be anything remembered if we don't do some smart things soon.
Good answer. Okay. I know you have an appointment at 4 o'clock, so I'm not going to keep you too long. I just want to thank you, Dr. Eisenberg. We were friends a long, long time ago, and today we meet again under very positive circumstances.
Yes, yes.
Tremendously talking to you and your book that I read with great interest. And I think it's a really important book. I recommend it very highly. So once again, the name of the book is Dream It to Do It, The Science and the Magic. We didn't have time to talk about the magic, perhaps next time. And
I would look forward to that.
and I just want to remind my listeners that my next guest is going to be Emmy Vadney. She's an intuitive development coaching practitioner. And so that should be very interesting and kind of follow up, I think, in a way to Dr. Howard Eisenberg's book. So we wish you all the best luck, lots and lots of sales, and we shall keep in touch.
Thank you, Tom. Stay well. Till next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.